TUPARI, Franz, Caspar. Chapter 1. To Switzerland or to the Savages. January 1948. I was standing at the counter of a travel agency in La Paz, the capital of Bolivia, inquiring about the best route to Europe. The clerk spread out a map of South America in front of me. Just think over the various alternatives. If you don't want to fly via Rio de Janeiro and Dakar, you can go to Buenos Aires by train. You will find plenty of liners there on which we book passages, or you can go to the Pacific coast and board a ship at Arequipa, Arica, or Malindo. Then you would also see the Panama Canal, but none of these routes taken by many thousands of travelers every year really appealed to me. The longer I pored over the map, the more my gaze was drawn in another direction. From the Cordillera eastwards, almost across the whole continent, wound a blue line, the Amazon, which, fed by 1,000 rivers great and small, rolls in 1,000 bends from the Andes down to the Atlantic. Could I leave South America without seeing this mightiest of all rivers and the vast jungles which border it? The Bolivian at the inquiry counter shook his head. Arranging a journey down to the Amazon, he said, was outside his sphere. As far as he knew, such a venture could only turn out badly. Malaria, yellow fever, a plague of insects, wild animals. However, I left the travel agency without a berth or a ticket. My mind was made up. I proposed first of all to fly to the Brazilian frontier, and there I would consider my next move. It was March when I left Cochabamba, a friendly town on the eastern slope of the Andes, and the headquarters of the Bolivian airline Lloyd Aero Boliviano. From 7,500 feet, the twin-engined Douglas rose effortlessly to some 15,000 feet and floated over the snow-capped Cordillera and the rifted valleys of the Andes down to the vast green plains of Mojos. Bathed in sweat, we landed in the Trinidad capital of the department of Beni, and then flew on over the villages of San Joaquin, Magdalena, and Guayaramerin to Riberalta, which in a few decades has grown from the rubber collecting posts of a few Swiss pioneers into a town of more than 10,000 inhabitants. A few days later, a small steamer took me down the River Beni to Cachuela Esperanza, the center of a huge rubber enterprise, and from there I went by Lorry Strait through the jungle to the Rio Mamor as far as Guayaramerin. Guayaramerin, also called Puerto Sucre, is a small, god-forsaken spot on the frontier between Bolivia and Brazil. Outside the village, the muddy waters of the Rio Mamor roll towards a chain of roaring rapids, and the jungle advances in a semicircle almost to the back doors of its huts. In the sandy streets and on the large village green, the cows and a few lean horses graze, and in the modest little houses roofed with palm leaves, live about 1,000 Indians, white and half-breeds. On the riverbank stand the ramshackle warehouses of the American agents. Back in the war years, Guayamarin had been one of the most important centers of a brisk trade in rubber. The airfield, too, probably dates from this time. Today, there are but few traces of the rubber trade, but the people of Guayamarin cannot believe that the days of prosperity are over. Cheer up, they told themselves, encouragingly. There'll be a third world war, and then business will start up again. Well, Guayamarin's dreams of rubber did not trouble me for long. I was a passenger on his way through to Europe. I intended crossing the Mamor on the following morning, and once on the Brazilian side, boarding a train on the Madeira-Mamor line. I was delighted at the idea, for the rumors of the rickety track of this railway and of the Indians who were accustomed to attack derailed trains promised an adventurous journey. I was sitting at lunch in the little hotel, whose walls bore the legend Hotel Royal, Royal in large letters, and was toiling away with a blunt knife at a tough piece of roast beef. At the next table a few rubber merchants and customs officials, with their shirt sleeves rolled up, were dicing for a round of beer. In a corner sat a family of colas, the name given to Bolivians from the uplands. A gentleman with dark hair and an aquiline nose joined me at my table. From his appearance, he might have been one of the so-called Turcos, the Syrians or Lebanese who migrated in hordes to South America some decades ago, and who, being traders with a good head for business, had often made considerable fortunes. He stared gloomily at the thin soup and began a noisy meal. Now and again he glanced at the newspaper which the aircraft had just brought in from the capital. A steamer had come down from Trinidad, and the dining room slowly filled up with guests who chatted and gesticulated with animation. A third traveler joined our table, a trim, unostentatious man in his 50s with shrewd gray eyes. "Bruckner," he said, by way of introduction, and offered me his hand. I was astonished to hear the sound of German. "I gather you are Swiss, passing through, I take it." We fell into conversation. My neighbor had come out to Bolivia about 35 years before, and had built up himself an enviable livelihood. He owned a chain of estancias with thousands of heads of cattle, not to mention profitable rubber estates, a few smallish sugar plantations, and a large store in Magdalena, which was about an hour and a half away by air, or 5 days by motor boat. "If one's lucky, one can do quite well in Bolivia," I hazarded. "Lucky, do you say? Everyone thinks that, especially the Bolivians. It's not very often that luck helps you to get on, or intelligence, or what you learnt at school. Perseverance every time, that's the thing. And that's just what these people here haven't got. It's the same with most immigrants. They think that they ought to earn millions in a few years and lose heart when they run up against their first difficulties. Things don't move as quickly as all that. You've got to be able to sit tight and wait. Try again. Work and slave. "Well, what have you been doing in Bolivia?" I told him about my work as a teacher in a mission on the Rio Beni, where I had taught little Indian boys their ABC and distributed many quinine and atropine tablets, and of my rise to the post of manager of the mission's China bark business. "Then I expect you've picked up a lot in these few years." He nodded. "Perhaps more than I have in 35 years. "I mustn't grumble," I laughed. "There is just one thing, though." "What's that?" "Indians," I answered. "Wild Indians. I've lived side by side with Indians for some years now, but they were all more or less civilized. What I've never yet seen are real wild Indians. That can be remedied if you're willing to spare some time." Bruckner gave me a searching glance. He was quite serious. Near the village of Baris, he owned an estancia with a few hundred head of cattle. There, one of his sons had been trying for years to settle a tribe of wild Indians. They would stay for a few months, help to tend the cattle and work on the plantations, and then suddenly vanish into the jungle again. "Come with me to Magdalena. There's bound to be an opportunity of going out to the estancia," he concluded. "You can wait there until the Indians come in again." "And how long can that take?" "It's hard to say. Perhaps a few weeks, perhaps a few months. But I can see you're in a hurry. Your ideas of time have probably already become European again. If that is so, then perhaps this gentleman here can give you better advice, for as it happens, you're in just the right company." And with that he introduced me to our neighbor, the somber gentleman who was so unmistakably drinking his soup. He had taken me for a Jewish emigrant, and since the Arab states were at war with Israel, had hereto not favored me with a single glance, let alone a greeting. He was, as I had thought, a Lebanese, but had been living in Bolivia for 20 or 30 years. A dentist by profession, he had laid aside his drill and forceps and set up as a retailer, a dealer in rubber and cattle, and even as an active politician and mayor of a Bolivian community. As an exploiter of large areas of jungle in the province of Itenes, he had often come into contact with wild Indians, and had, so he said, tamed a large number of these jungle dwellers, and trained them to be useful rubber gatherers and cattle drovers. He was now on his way into the forests of the Rio Itenes, being on good terms with politicians in La Paz. He had obtained money from the government to go in search of a legendary Spanish fortress dating from the colonial period. At the same time, he proposed to hunt up a dispersed tribe of wild Indians and take them to a state reserve. "Real wild Indians?" I asked doubtfully. "Of course. Why don't you come with me? We shall be back in 2 months at the most. You can always go on to Europe then. Would you like to?" Would I like to? We went on to discuss the probable cost of such a trip. Nor was this unimportant, for half was to come out of my pocket. But I was as good as in the jungle now. At least I was to see wild Indians, was to share their life for a few days in their jungle home, and observe on the spot the primitive mode of life of a wild tribe. And so I agreed with the Turco on a joint expedition to the Rio Quatario. Bruckner wished me luck in the venture. Mind you, don't end up in the savages' stew pot instead of in Switzerland, he warned me as he took his leave. The next day he left by air for Magdalena. The Lebanese still had a few days' business to attend to in Goya-Ra-Murin. Then we would travel together to the village of San Joaquin. I know the place well, he explained. We shall find there everything we need for our trip. Our departure, however, was put off from one day to the next. The plans of the Lebanese grew vaguer and vaguer. He avoided me, and one day he admitted that he had to fly to La Paz on some business or other. He seemed to have forgotten our plans. There I sat, alone, with the suspicion that this fanatic had only wanted to squat as long as possible beside my radio in order to hear 100 times over every day the latest news of the fighting in Palestine. It was enough to drive one to despair. I could not possibly start my expedition up the unknown rivers on speculation. On the other hand, I had dreamed myself into an unbounded desire for adventure, and I was now fully determined to seek out a tribe of wild Indians at all hazards. And so I took the ferry over to Mamor, to the Brazilian shore, to seek the advice of the bishop, who was reputed to be an expert on Indians. A motorboat took me quickly across the Guajara Miram, called Guajara for short by the natives. In Guajara there was more activity than in the Bolivian village opposite. True, there were no paved streets here either, but they did not let the grass grow just as it liked. After every shower, an imposing bulldozer smoothed out the broad, sandy roads. Many of the houses were of stone and roofed with tiles, some of them imported from distant Para. In the main streets, shop succeeded shop, and one could buy anything one liked. Down towards the river lay the station. A majestic American steam locomotive was just at that moment shunting a train loaded with bales of rubber and tree trunks, which was to set out the next day on its journey of some 200 miles to Porto Vallejo, where the railway started. I soon discovered the little church. The clocks in the tower had obviously fallen victims to the damp climate. Each one indicated a different time, but in any case, what was the point of clocks in this village? It is well known that for those lucky enough to live in thinly populated tropical areas, no hour ever strikes. I rang the bell of the prelazia, the bishop's house. A negro boy admitted me and led me into the yard at the back. There I found Monsignor in his overalls, sweating and liberally bespattered with engine oil. "Forgive me if I don't shake hands," was his greeting, uttered in the most cordial tones. "I'm just at this moment busy repairing the motor for our boat. Do you know all about these things?" I had to disillusion him. Monsignor Ray came from peasant stock in central France. He was a missionary of the Third Order of St. Francis, a forest explorer known far beyond the confines of his diocese, and the leading authority on the Brazilian Guapore district. He summoned the black boy and told him to make coffee. Then he rolled himself a fat cigarette and handed me his tobacco pouch and cigarette papers. Our food is brought from the kitchen of the sisters who run the school, and so we manage to keep body and soul together. He smiled, but coffee and cigarettes are far more important, and now and again a drop of brandy. Without it, you would go under with malaria here, or be bitten to death by mosquitoes and worms. Here in Brazil, we call brandy mata bicho, worm poison. I then began to talk about the favor I had to ask of him, and he took up the question with great interest. A pity I have to be in France in May. Quite honestly, I would rather go with you to the Indians. It was not easy to follow the French patois of this ecclesiastic, and frequently he lapsed into Portuguese without realizing it. He seemed more fluent in this language, but for the moment it meant absolutely nothing to me. Mon Dieu, think yourself lucky that you've got rid of the Lebanese, he said consolingly. Where he was going to take you, there haven't been any real savages for a long time now. At the most, there are a few Indian rubber tappers wandering about who have learned from the whites and blacks how to loaf about and steal. With the means at your disposal, the only area where you can still today see Indians in their natural state is the Rio Branco, a few days' journey beyond the mouth of the river. There is a barricado, that's to say, a rubber collecting point, called São Luís. There's a German manager working there, a young man like yourself. He will be glad to have a visitor, and he will help you to get farther into the jungle. Without such help, it is hard to come into contact with wild Indians. Of course, there are some Indians here as well, quite near, but they are hostile to the whites, and how can you hope to get near such fellows? They would put a bullet through you straight away. You wouldn't be the first either. The bishop made me a rough sketch of the Guapore and its tributaries. Guapore is the Brazilian name for the Rio Itenes. Here is the Rio Branco, he explained. I've been up it several times, and our motorboat, once I even capsized, all alone in the jungle. That wasn't very pleasant, but luckily the rubber company's boat appeared just then. Otherwise, I should have had to sit for weeks between crocodiles and anacondas and finally starve. And the Indians, I was growing impatient. The Indians live in quite another place, in the district round the source of the river, which you can't reach by boat. You have to walk into the forest for perhaps 8 or 10 days, and then you will come upon their huts. On that occasion I had no time to go deeper, but I know there are still tribes there who have scarcely any contact with the whites. You would find a lot to study there. I inquired about books on the Indian tribes in the district, but the bishop knew of none. True and more, on the big river, a German explorer had pursued his researches for a few months and written a book about them, but it was unobtainable here. But do call on the owner of the Rio Branco rubber concern. He lives near here. And as for a map, your best plan would be to call and see the headmistress of our girls' school. There are certainly no maps on sale here. You would be well advised not even to inquire about them either. You might easily be taken for a spy. People can be very queer sometimes. The rubber magnet, Senor R., was also extremely helpful. The very next boat would take news of my impending arrival to San Luis. Occasionally Indians from tribes still untouched by civilization and living in the interior, Nacera and the mountains, reached there. They work for only a short time in the fields of the Baracado, and then they vanish again into the forest. There are the Tupari, for example. They are still cannibals, but they won't harm a white man. By the way, we may perhaps meet again on the Rio Branco. I intend to make a tour of inspection during the next few weeks. I've been appointed traveling police chief of the district. I also called on the headmistress of the girls' school. She lent me her map of the Guapur district, and I made a rough copy of it. But the map, in which the imagination of the cartographer had obviously played a greater part than the work of the surveyors, was not all I received from this obliging Frenchwoman. With a smile she passed me a handful of photographs. They had been taken a few years before up on the Guapur by one of the fathers. There now lay before me the portrait of two naked fellows, with a look which was half wild and half stupid, and holding a bow and arrow. Tupari Indians of the Rio Branco, brave warriors and cannibals, was noted in the margin. These figures were not exactly calculated to inspire confidence. The two men had stared at the camera with fear and mistrust. The father and his apparatus must have been strange and uncanny to them. What sort of faces, I wondered, would these jungle folk pull if I were to visit them one day in their huts, for I had now firmly resolved to track down the Tupari. Preparations, well, of course, they had to be made. My equipment and articles for barter I bought in the shops of the Brazilian town of Guajara, and apart from the goods the merchants willingly gave me, their advice to take with me on my adventurous journey. You want bush knives for wild Indians. For heaven's sake, be careful who gave you that idea. Or are you traveling for some museum or for an Adventist mission? You're not. Do you know what happened recently up on one of the rivers? A boat with several traders and other passengers tied up on the bank. An Indian naked with bow and arrows comes out of the forest and calls out that he would like a knife. "Faca faca," cries the wretch, and offers his bow and arrows in exchange. One of the passengers climbs up the slope and hands him a bush knife. What does the savage do? Takes the knife and brings it down on the man's head, so that he rushes down the slope covered in blood. That's what Indians are like. And what happened to Lieutenant Fernandez? What? You haven't yet heard anything about Lieutenant Fernandez. You must have come from a long way off. Lieutenant Fernandez was captured a few years ago by the Bocas Negras while out hunting and carried off. He simply vanished into thin air. His brother, who is also an officer, undertook large-scale rescue expeditions. Military aircraft patrolled the whole area, and the Americans even came with a helicopter. They found nothing except deserted huts. Once these savages manage to lay hands on a white man, he is done for. If they don't eat him, he is held prisoner. He has to work, hunt, and fish like them. He's given a wife and has to have children, but he never gets away. With my head full of these grisly reports, I paid the bishop a second visit. "That may all be quite right," he nodded, again offering me some of his thick black coffee. "I could tell you even worse things, but there are Indians and Indians. You must always distinguish between those who have had a bad experience with white people and those who have got on well with them. I have also had some adventures in these forests." Lapped in the smoke of a fat cigarette of black tobacco, Monsignor began his story. "I was once going by motorboat to St. Louis and went into the nearest huts of the rubber gatherers, and also into the Moluccas of the Indians. There was a chief living there who was also a sorcerer, and whites call him Tomas Antonio. I had been warned about him. He had the reputation of being a notorious poisoner, but I didn't worry about that. Mon Dieu, the tricks they haven't tried out on me. In the dark hut I saw a huge hammock. Stop, I said to myself, that would be a magnificent thing to show at the forthcoming mission expedition in Sao Paulo. I bargained with the old man and offered him my 3-barreled gun in exchange. I suppose you know these guns with 2 barrels for shot and a 3rd barrel above that for 44 cartridges. The old man took the gun and wouldn't give it up again. He seemed to like the deal, but he didn't untie the hammock. He vanished into the darkness of the Molucca and came back grinning with a gourd full of chicha. Why not drink to the exchange? I drank up the chicha. That is a guest duty. I shouldn't forget about the hammock. Then I noticed my limbs gradually growing cold and stiff. I jumped up, ran to the brook, and put a finger down my throat in vain. Panic seized me. I had been poisoned. I called my companions, a few civilized Indians, seeing what the stuff contained. The main thing was to keep moving, for only in this way can you keep the heart working and sweat out the poison. If you're lucky. The road back to St. Louis was a bad one. I covered the whole stretch without stopping, at full pelt. I could no longer feel what my legs were doing, and had no sensation left in my hands. But we did it. There's nothing like a good stomach. The bishop laughed. And the sorcerer? I asked. The sorcerer? I never set eyes on him again. He's probably still living in his Molucca. That didn't happen so very long ago. But I didn't mean to scare you by telling you. But do bear in mind that just as with the white and yellow and black races, so too among the Indians there are bad characters. In any case, you probably won't be alone among them. He added after a pause, about a month ago I met a couple of journalists from Buenos Aires at the mouth of the Rio Branco. They were also looking for wild Indians and had drawn a blank on the Rio Colorado. I advised them to go up the Rio Branco. You may possibly meet them in the jungle. Meanwhile, in my little room, a complete general store had been assembled. The necessary provisions: rice, farinha, sugar, tea, coffee, mate, salt, lard, roast groundnuts and maize, baked banana slices, and a few dozen tins of canned food. Anything not packed in tins was soon nibbled at by the hungry rats, which swarmed into the village at night from the river. In addition, there were the treasures, which were intended to win the Indians over to me: bush knives, kitchen knives, necklaces, matches, bracelets, lipsticks, sewing needles, colored thread, red printed cotton fabrics, plates, cups, cigarette papers, soup spoons and small teaspoons, scented hair oil in little bottles, perfumed pomades and soap, dozens of mirrors, tobacco in long twists, pipes, sweets, hair slides and combs, rings with magnificent glass stones, and half a dozen cheap mouth organs. In addition, there were fishing hooks of all sizes and much more besides. My personal equipment consisted of a 12-bore shotgun and a few boxes of cartridges, a Colt with the appropriate ammunition, a storm lantern, 2 pocket torches, a lighter, axe and bush knife, a bag with a change of linen, a few bars of soap, a medicine chest, which I had got together with great difficulty, and the camp bed of the tropics, a hammock, with the indispensable mosquito net, and a few blankets. Nor did I want to leave my portable radio behind. And finally, there was my camera, patiently waiting for some worthwhile subjects. All this weighed about 500 weight, and it took me days to pack my baggage in boxes, or the ordinary local cotton bags, made watertight with crude rubber. Chapter 2: The Voyage to the Rio Branco. Once a month, a government mail boat leaves Guaxara and goes up the lower Mamor to Guapor, and following the frontier between Bolivia and Brazil on to the former capital, Villa Bella or Matarazzo. The distance is some 750 miles, and if there is no drought at the time and the rapids and shallows do not make the Guapor hard to negotiate, the journey takes 14 days. About halfway to the Rio Branco flows into the Guapor from the northeast. The mouth of this tributary was my first objective. When at last the mail boat was rocking alongside the river bank, the crew was missing. They were on strike. No money in the till, said the official of the shipping agency, and shrugged his shoulders. But surely the company is a state concern. That's just the point. It's true they collect the postage dues and the passage money, but there are certain gentlemen who overlook a mere trifle like paying the crew. We have sent telegram after telegram to the governor. Now it seems that the mail boat will probably be able to start in a week's time. Wait another week. 1 week might easily grow into 2 or 3. I wandered irritably along the river, when I came upon a smallish motor boat which was preparing to leave. It belonged to a rubber merchant. True, it was going to the Rio Esmuguel, which flows into the Guapor below the Rio Branco, but on the way the Bolivian Indian colony of Moor, of which the superintendent, Don Luis League, had recently invited me to visit him, I could disembark at Moor and wait for the mail boat. No sooner thought than done. Porters rolled my boxes and bags to the landing place. A black policeman was eyeing the motley party. The rubber merchant, glad of any passenger, pocketed in person the fares and baggage freight. The motor was already chugging, and keeping close inshore, we started up the muddy waters of the Rio Mamor. In our boat, of course, there was no question of there being any cabins or the like. There was only the wheelhouse, which was covered with a primitive roof of palm leaves. The dozen passengers spread hammocks from the stanchions of the roof. Moreover, one could scarcely move without colliding with one's neighbors, both men and women, and setting their hammocks in unwelcome motion. Everyone piled suitcases, boxes, and sacks wherever they ran, least danger of being crushed or soaked by a sudden shower, for the rainy season was not yet over, and dark clouds were already rising over the edge of the jungle. The middle of this decrepit vessel was barred to luggage. There a small mulatto boy bailed out with an enamel plate and a petrol can the water which had oozed into the boat. The stern was occupied by the kitchen. An old negress stirred away incessantly at sooty pots, which bubbled over a small wood fire. Her young assistant peeled yucca tubers whenever he didn't happen to be busy bailing out water. Over the stove dangled a few pieces of raw meat, with a swarm of blue bottles buzzing around. Since, unlike the steamers, our motor boat did not need to load wood, we put into land only seldom. This soon caused some passengers to be taken short, for there was, of course, no lavatory on board. But not even the entreaties of the passengers in distress could induce the boatman to tie up once. In the evening, I was shown how, in a small vessel on the Amazon, one can get over such difficulties in the most simple and natural way possible. Before she went to sleep, the woman on my left took a chamber pot and a sheet from her suitcase. Her neighbor came to her assistance, all without a word being exchanged. One of the women stretched out the sheet with both hands like a folding screen. The other vanished behind it, together with her pot. Then they changed places. When the affair was concluded to the satisfaction of both, the women exchanged a friendly and grateful smile. The sheet was folded up, the pot rinsed in the river, and both were shut up again in the suitcase. Boa noite, boa noite. Everyone settled down to sleep. The motor roared determinedly on, and the night jungle glided past on both sides like the ghostly wings of a stage. During the second night, we left the fast-flowing Mamor and turned into the calmer Guapor. Long before dawn, we landed on the Bolivian bank. There lay Moore, the little Indian settlement where I proposed to wait for transport to the mouth of the Rio Branco. The Indians of this colony, Moor or Aten, had only recently become civilized. As late as 1933, the German explorer Heinrich Snethlige had been able to track down the hideouts of these dreaded robbers and killers only with great difficulty and danger. What was left of the Moor tribe had now become a friendly and industrious family, whose well-being was looked after by the superintendent of the colony, Papa Lug, and his pretty, amiable, and capable wife, Donna Yolanda. I was hospitably received. The girls have brewed a few jugs of chicha in your honor, Donna Legu disclosed to me one day. After dinner we will arrange a small dance, if you don't mind. As night was falling, the musicians appeared, young Indians with flutes, drums, and kettle drums. And to the gay Bolivian and Brazilian tunes, The Indian girls and young men danced the samba, maxisi, carnavalito, tachiari, marshisha, and kaluyo, so that even to watch it was sheer delight. But those former savages could do more than dance and make music. I was able to see that during the days which followed, whenever I strolled through the settlement, under the supervision of Mama Yolanda, Indian women, both young and old, made excellent cheese and butter. They produced various kinds of sausage and other delicacies, made soap for washing day out of ox tallow and ashes, knew how to melt down the pig lard, which was in such demand, and out of great quantities of huge yucca roots they peeled, grated, and roasted the delicious chive meal, which is indispensable in those parts. The girls had enough time left over for other kinds of work. They turned out shapely water jugs and other pottery. On the potter's wheel, fed the pigs, poultry, and ducks, helped in the kitchen and the garden, and learned their ABC at school. In a word, they were training themselves in every respect to be capable women who need fear no comparison with the so-called civilizados. The majority of the men and boys worked on the plantations, together with a white foreman. A few of them also made bricks and tiles, which were used for buildings in the colony or were sold in the villages downriver. Everywhere work was going placidly ahead, and the cheerful and frank bearing of these lovable people was most striking. I spent a fortnight in Moore. The mailboat kept me waiting, and then the little Jacques came puffing up against the powerful current. She had a boat in tow on either side, for the steamer itself carries only the engine and the cooking range together with its equipment. My luggage was taken aboard. In the process, one of the hands dropped one of the boxes into the water, and while they had a nice, leisurely discussion about how best to fish it out again without getting their feet wet, I took leave of my new amigos. One may be a guest in a place like this for only a few days, but even so, leave-taking is sad. The steamer whistled twice, the hands hauled in the cables, and the engine prepared to start once more. On the boat, I was greeted by a hearty bonjour. Two French missionaries from Guajara. They were on their way to the small village of Pedros Negros and intended to build a schoolhouse and a chapel there. "How did you get on in Moore?" they asked with interest. "League's a good fellow, and a thorough gentleman, don't you think? If only all so-called Indian protectors were like him." I began to settle in on the boat. There were no cabins, not even for first-class passengers. Men, women, and children slept on the open deck, which in addition served as a living room and dining saloon. The great steam boiler, which was in the open, radiated an unbearable heat. I spread my hammock well forward in the bows, but alas, only a few hours had passed before I was told to make room. We had moored by a solitary hut, and the hands had to take on a great pile of firewood. And so it continued, not only by day, but all through the night as well. The mosquitoes swooped bloodthirstily on all living flesh, which was not in safety behind the protective netting. And food, when the cook gave the sign for a meal, Half the passengers had to clear their hammocks out of the way. The table was set up like a market stall, with 2 trestles and a board. 2 planks set on low boxes formed the seats. The steward then brought on his delicacies: rice, black beans, dried meat boiled up, and musty farinha. For dessert, cafezinho, a small cup of strong black coffee, was served. None of it would have tasted so bad if the revolting, battered tin cutlery and the makeshift waiter had not spoiled all appetite. This black-haired, olive-skinned young man thought nothing, while he was serving the meal, of wiping his nose with his hand in full view of the guests, and cleaning his fingers on the rail or his napkin. But the new hat he had just bought he kept constantly on his head. Besides this, indescribable odors assailed us from all sides, from the corner where the cooking went on, from the latrine, from the sweating passengers and crew, and from the salt meat, which the fresh air, with its heat and humidity, was slowly turning rotten. "Damn this traveling," swore a young Brazilian. "Things used to be very different here when Don Ernesto ran the mail boats. Today everything belongs to the state, that's to say, belongs to no one, and the service goes from bad to worse." This Don Ernesto, a merchant named Kohler from Hamburg, had come to the district about 50 years before, and become the pioneer of trade on the Guapore. His business had been the most important on the river, but when the Second World War broke out, he, like many other Germans, Italians, and Japanese, had been sent to an internment camp and his property confiscated. The steamer toiled slowly upstream. On the jungle bank, solitary and forlorn huts sprang into view. The planters stood on the edge of the sloping bank, with their wives and children, and remained motionless, watching our ungainly vessel puffing past and vanishing round the next bend. Again and again, whether it was day or night, we had to put in to take on huge piles of firewood. On the second day we reached Fort Principe da Beira, a fortification long since abandoned. The Portuguese had built it nearly 200 years before, when Spanish colonists threatened to thrust into their territory from what is now Bolivia. Beside the desolate mounds of masonry, a small Brazilian garrison was now quartered in wretched huts of corrugated iron. Not one of the frontier guards asked me for a passport. They themselves would have thought it discourteous. Whenever the steamer moored, the passengers used to go ashore. Only very few of them had business to do, but it was nice to stretch one's legs a little. It was too boring to swing in one's hammock day after day, reading old newspapers or third-rate novels, while the captain handed out the mail and the crew took on fresh firewood. The passengers chatted with the riverside dwellers, who always welcomed the arrival of the steamer as a great event. According to the time of day, the greeting exchanged was "Bon dia," or "Boa tarde," or, if it was night, "Boa noite, senor." Those who were closer acquainted embraced and exchanged a friendly slap on the back. "How's the family? What news from the outside world? What's been going on here since last time? Does anyone know anything about the new price of the castanha?" The castana is the Brazil nut. Everywhere in these parts the rubber gatherers employ their enforced leisure during the rainy season in harvesting these nuts, which grow wild. Little was said about rubber. There was some grumbling about the low price offered by the Brazilian, and particularly the Bolivian government. They talked politics all the more, however. The Southerners are past masters of this art. The best thing the president could do is to retire at once, otherwise he'll only plunge the country further into poverty, was the cry. Now, Gatilio, there was a man for you. It was exactly the same here as anywhere else in the world. The government of the day is always the worst. But when the talk turned to international affairs, strong criticism was leveled at the United States. We're really fed up with this everlasting exploitation. These Yankees take us for miserable niggers and Indians. What else are our countries in their eyes but colonies? True, there was no sympathy expressed for the great opponents of North America either, but there was very, very little Pan-American feeling in evidence. No South American would risk his skin in another war. That seemed to be quite clearly fixed in their minds. Even the Bolivians, who normally have not much good to say for the Brazilians, agreed with them on this point. Only one young trader listened to these polemics without uttering a word. Later, as we strolled back together to the landing stage, he remarked suddenly, "Did you hear that, senor? We Brazilians open our mouths very wide, but we're not much good at doing a good job of work. Everything we possess that's any good was introduced by foreigners, and we imitate it more or less successfully, but no one will admit it. Believe me, the best thing for us would really be to become a colony for 20 years. That's the only way we could learn what order and progress mean. But of course, that would mean a bunch of parasites having to dirty their hands with honest work or else starve. By the way, did you notice the fellow who was running down the Yankees most vigorously? He's a fine one to grumble. When the war started, he received a big advance from the American Rubber Agency. He kept the money from the Yankee government and blued it, but the rubber he had promised he sold to someone else on the black market. We got into our hammocks again. The crew took in the plank, which served as a gangway, and the steamer puffed on along the bank through the endless jungle. Those who know the Amazon district well praise the Guapore as being the most beautiful river far and wide, and are probably thinking, as they do so, of the dry season, when the blue water reflects the broad sandy shore, when the caimans and giant tortoises are basking in the sun, and the banks are alive with innumerable waterfowl. But even now, at the end of the rainy season, the landscape was attractive and picturesque. The water did not flow turbid and muddy like that of the rivers which come down from the Andes. The banks had not given way, nor were they cut off by steep slopes or dark walls of jungle. The forest rose gently from low beds of reeds and bushes up to the distant garland of giant trees, their tops blooming red and yellow, and together with the manifold shades of green offering a magnificent sight. The planters and traders, however, evinced little feeling for this splendor. "You see," explained a Bolivian colonist, "you find this primitive landscape beautiful, but none of this land is any good for planting. It is all coarse sand, and underneath there is clay and nothing more. To find good soil, one must go deeper into the interior, but even there it is never as good as on the Mamor or the Beni. The fertility of the banks of the Mamor and the Beni was praised on all sides. Since the days of remote antiquity, these rivers, like the Nile in Egypt, had swept down huge masses of earth from the mountains and slowly filled a broad basin with fertile mud. The waters of the gentle Guapor and its tributaries, on the other hand, rise in softly undulating tableland, and in the savannas of Mato Grosso, Chiquitos, and Mojos. Why don't the planters simply move to the Mamor if that is the promised land? Here we are in the best rubber district. We came here after rubber and latex. Here we have laid out the necessary plantations and built our houses, at least what we call houses, but everyone realizes today that we would have done better to leave the rubber in the trees. Anyone who now has rice, maize, beans, and mandioca is a rich man. You have to scour the whole river to buy a few bananas, an egg, or even a young pig or fowl. Often the rubber gatherers and traders can scarcely pay their debts. It had meanwhile grown dark. The passengers swayed sleepily in their hammocks. A few tireless ones still squatted over a game of cards, but suddenly there was great excitement. Something seemed to be wrong with the boiler. The firebox glowed bright red, and so did the funnel. It was spitting out an apparently endless rain of sparks, which lit up fantastically the dark waters of the Guapor and the fringe of the jungle. The black stoker tried in vain to open the door of the furnace, which was also glowing red. The safety valves are blocked. The boiler's bound to blow up any minute. That can be dangerous, nodded a trader uneasily. A few years back, one of these things did explode. There was one single bang, and you could then pick up corpses and the fragments of the boat over a radius of a few hundred yards. The young captain rushed wildly hither and thither. Finally, he ordered the vessel to be put in and moored to a tree. It was impossible to abandon ship. On the bank, which was flooded to quite a depth, one could only too easily be eaten by alligators and huge water snakes, or be attacked by piranhas. So we waited to see what would happen, but we were not blown up. The furnace gradually cooled down. The shower of sparks ceased, and the ship's mechanic repaired the fault. Soon we were under steam again. The steward told us to clear away the hammocks so that he could set up the table for the belated evening meal. On the 5th night we were slumbering peacefully. Towards morning, more wood had to be taken on. The crew woke us out of our sleep. The helmsman on duty, a jovial negro, nudged me gently. "Senor, I think you ought to get up. We've reached the Rio Branco."